Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. But in the meantime, please write in the chat box who you are and where you're joining us from. Please also select your language while you wait. To select a language, click on the globe icon where you see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It will then take you to the English or French channel, and you can choose to mute the original audio. Everyone needs to select a language to be able to listen to all of our speakers today. You may also select whether you'd like to continue to read captions during today's session. You should be seeing these captions automatically, but if not, please click on the icon with the 2 C's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. To hide these subtitles later, please click on the same icon and click Hide Subtitle from the menu that appears. These captions are generated using an automatic feature in Zoom, and therefore might not be 100% accurate. Captions are only available in Zoom in English at this time. We've also shared a few poll questions with you that we encourage you to respond to. If you'd like to read these questions in French, both the English and French questions are on the slide. The answer choices are in both English and French in the poll. So please take a few moments, introduce yourself in the chat with your name and where you're joining us from, select your language, select if you'd like to continue to read captions, and respond to the poll questions. We'll get started in just a few moments. Again, please take a few moments to introduce yourself in the chat, select your language, select if you'd like to continue to read captions, and respond to the poll questions. We'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you again for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone again to today's session. My name is Brittany Getch, and I'm a program officer on the Knowledge Success Project at Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. Knowledge Success is excited to be partnering with FP2030 on this series. This is our 17th conversation in the Connecting Conversations series. And if you've missed previous conversations, you can watch recordings on FP2030's YouTube channel or read blog post recaps on Knowledge Success's site and get up to speed. This conversation will last for approximately an hour, and we'll have an open Q&A discussion with our three speakers. It's being simultaneously interpreted into French, as I mentioned, and the French and English recordings will be available on FP2030's YouTube channel in the coming days. If you haven't already done so, please take this time to select your language by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It will then take you to the English or French channel. You can choose to mute the original audio. And a reminder about closed captioning, you can choose to continue to read captions during today's session. You should be able to see them automatically, but if not, please click on the icon with the two C's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. To hide them later, please click the same icon and click Hide Subtitle from the menu that appears. Participants are muted throughout the duration of this conversation, but if you have questions for our speakers, please add them in the chat box and as you follow along. My Knowledge Success and FP2030 colleagues will be moderating the chat box and we'll get to as many questions as time allows. A reminder to please be respectful of speakers and fellow participants when commenting or asking questions. Connecting Conversations is a series of discussions on adolescent and youth reproductive health, hosted by FP2030 and Knowledge Success. Through the end of this year, we'll be hosting these sessions every few weeks on a variety of topics. The series has been divided into 5 themes. We began with a look at a foundational understanding of adolescent development and health, and we continued our conversations by exploring engaging critical influencers to improve young people's reproductive health. And our third theme focused on adolescent responsive services. We're excited to wrap up this set of conversations on key youth populations with a discussion on meeting the SRH needs of young people from sexual and gender minorities. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to begin by looking at the poll answers. So if we could bring those up. Great, thank you. The first question, does your country disaggregate SRH data on young people by their sexual orientation? And it looks like the majority of you selected no. And the second question, does your country disaggregate SRH data on young people by gender? And the majority of you selected yes, that they disaggregate it based on gender, and gender defined as man and woman. And the third question, are young people from sexual and gender minorities considered in national SRH policies in your country? And it looks like the majority of you selected not sure. These are just a few of the many things that our speakers and moderator will be discussing today, and I want to thank you all for answering those poll questions. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator for our conversation, Kara Cross-Parada. Kara Cross-Parada is a public health project coordinator, researcher, and advocate. She's currently the project coordinator at Population Council's Girl Innovation Research and Learning Center, a global research center that generates, synthesizes, and translates evidence to transform the lives of adolescent girls. She provides operations and technical support to a portfolio of projects that test innovative interventions and evaluate issues affecting adolescents, such as education, early marriage, and sexual and reproductive health. She's a passionate LGBTQ+ advocate and is leading a first of its kind scoping review of literature on the health and well-being of sexual and gender minority adolescents in low and middle income countries. Kara earned her Bachelor of Arts in Molecular Biology from Skidmore College and is currently completing her Master in Public Health in Community Health at the City University of New York. Welcome, Kara, over to you.
Thank you, Brittany. Delighted to be here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And I'm excited to announce and introduce our 4 panelists who are joining us here today. First up, we have Sean Lord. Sean Lord is a dynamic, motivated, and empathetic social worker and youth advocate who possesses a talent for generating, building, and maintaining relationships with a strong and professional desire to improve people's lives, more specifically, the youths who may be considered marginalized and vulnerable. They strive to help with social development while promoting human rights and well-being. Our next panelist is Sara Imran. Sara is a young transgender activist and entrepreneur for human rights and development, especially from marginalized communities. She has been working in the field of human rights and development with various national and international organizations. She has taken part in the United Nations Universal Periodic Review process in 2017 by contributing to reports on sexual and reproductive health and rights issues faced by young people in Pakistan, as well as transgender issues in Pakistan. She has also worked on different research projects aimed at understanding and highlighting the issues of marginalized communities. Apart from that, she has also worked with Harvard University, UKAID, and UNICEF for advocacy-based research, people's perspectives about health services in Pakistan, and adolescents development in South Asia, respectively. Our third speaker is Ramesh Nadeem, who is a young Muslim organizer who oversees the Muslim Youth Leadership Council and International Youth Leadership Council in his work as program manager of international and Muslim youth advocacy at Advocates for Youth. He graduated in 2019 with his Bachelor's of Arts with honors from Southwestern University. They also serve as the Director of Programming at IAMM, where they oversee community town halls, podcast production, and special events. Their voice on domestic Muslim issues and international human rights frameworks has been featured in publications and spaces such as the Austin Chronicle, Teen Vogue, USA Today, Encore, and Facing Race, among other national platforms. Then lastly, and certainly not least, we have speaker Jessie Castellano. Jessie is a licensed psychometrician with strong advocacy for gender sensitivity, transgender rights, as well as sexual orientation and gender expression themes. She obtained her bachelor's degree in psychology with a major in clinical psychology. She has been the country coordinator of the Philippines for YAFP and the program officer for Transcend by Love Yourself. She has also taken an active role as the program officer for the sustainability of HIV services for key populations in Asia. She obtained her fellowship in Amplifying Trans Fellowship in Asia Pacific Transgender Network, Thailand. She is currently taking further studies for health across the gender spectrum at Stanford University and gender dysphoria at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to be chatting with you today. So to get us started, the first question that we'd love for all of the panelists to weigh in on is about the terms and language we use when discussing LGBTQ or young people from sexual and gender minorities. And so we'll have Sean, if you want to kick it off, if you could share what terminology do you use in your work and why?
Good morning, everybody. So as it relates to identifying with persons from the community, we try our very best to use the correct terminologies, whether it be the pronouns or whatever persons may use to identify themselves. We also very much sensitize our staff members to understand that these are the correct terms and it's basically a violation to not respect the pronouns that persons may choose to be recognized as. So that's our first thing at JFlag. We understand person's pronoun, we respect it, and we try our very best to use it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sarah, would you like to weigh in next?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, the pronouns are very important, and especially because transgender community is proceeding and in their rights and empowerment since like 2 to 3 years majorly in Pakistan, and it's a new concept for people to work with pronouns. So yeah, it's been a practice, and we are sensitizing people to ask about the preferred pronoun uh, uh, from a transgender person before like addressing or before talking to them.
That's wonderful. Ramesh, is there anything else you'd like to add in?
Yeah, so most of the time in the work we're using like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning LGBTQ in like our documentation and papers and all of this, but then in practice we're using queer and trans as like a blanket term. Another thing that's really interesting about like the international aspect of my work is that I keep learning more and more new vocabulary around queer and trans identities globally. So for example, like in a South Asian context, folks at different groups at different times are using terms like Wajasira or Hijra or trans, and then have different levels of identification with like trans identities. And so one thing that we found really important is to like legitimate all the different ways in which people are identifying, but also disidentifying with certain identity markers. While also trying to expand our capacity on understanding why maybe folks are disidentifying with certain identity markers that we would otherwise, identify them with.
Wonderful. That's great to hear, and important to not only the work that's been around about sensitizing staff to ensure that pronouns are always respected, but also listening to what's going on in the international community. And Jesse, would you like to weigh in on anything else?
Yeah, I think everybody has mentioned like the most important things like the pronouns and cultural specific language. But I think in the context of HIV and AIDS, particularly here in the Philippines, in my work, we kind of stray away from personal identity language because a person does not necessarily have to identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual to have had same-sex relations. So again, in the context of HIV and AIDS and like the world authorities, they have moved away from, as I said, personal identity language and into the language that would rather reflect practice. So that's why in our work, we use the terms men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women. So we can then avoid socially embedded stigma that's into that language.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, that's important to hear and important to note that in different areas and in different fields within this work that different languages are used and terminology is used, and knowing the context is key. So for our next question, we would love for you all to share a little bit about the needs and challenges among the young people that your organization serves. What are the needs and challenges you're frequently seeing among youth from gender and sexual minorities? Jesse, would you like to start this one?
All right. So I used to work for, as you have mentioned, from the sustainability of HIV services for key populations in Asia. And one of the projects that I have implemented was a qualitative research. And essentially what we did was a focus group among transgender women, particularly on their key issues, needs, and concerns with regard to their accessibility and the delivery of transgender health services. So one of the one of the major needs, among others, that our participants, the transgender women participants, have reported. Number one, at the most priority was HIV self-testing, and that's because the prioritize and they underline the importance of the safety and confidentiality that comes with HIV self-testing. And then another SRHR related needs that they have mentioned was teaching transgender women with regards to breast self-examination, especially those who are undergoing gender-affirming hormone therapy. And then another one, some of the combination prevention methods like pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, free condoms even, and then STIs testing. So those are like some of the major needs that transgender women particularly have mentioned to be most important for them. Yeah. And then also, if you want, we could share that study. If anyone needs a reference, I can always share that in the chat.
Wonderful. That's great to hear about the work that your organization is doing. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so in Pakistan, talking about the trans women, there are a lot of hurdles right now to for the gender transitioning services. They are not, the course is very expensive, and the local treatment and local practices are not safer for the transgender women. And the community-based organizations are making guidelines, hormonal guidelines for the transgender community, so that they can make a roadmap and a guideline for them to take hormones or like anything that comes with the sex reassignment surgery, etc.
Great, thank you. Sean, what would you like to talk a little bit more about other needs that your organization is seeing?
Most definitely. Okay, so what we did here in Jamaica, we created a youth organization called Equality Youth that handles specifically youth-related LGBT issues. So what we did, we did a focus group. We did various focus groups, and from the focus groups, we derived problems, and from the problem, we derived solutions, which we then created a document that was sent out to the government. So from the focus group, we've realized that access to healthcare is a big issue among LGBT persons in Jamaica. The fear, the stigma, the discrimination, persons are not willing to access certain healthcare spaces because of perceived treatment or treatment that they may genuinely receive based on their sexuality. We also found that basic information surrounding sexual and reproductive health is lacking. Also, we also found that access to justice is very, very much a big issue. Persons who may identify as LGBT, they don't feel secure. They don't feel they get the necessary responses as it relates to being violated in certain ways. So we don't have that period. Also, another big issue is access to certain spaces. So for example, educational spaces such as schools or, right, because of what you identify as or who you identify as, you're not allowed in certain spaces. And if you do feel the need to go to certain spaces, you're not treated fairly. So from all of that, we created a document, proposed a solution, and then we're trying to get policymakers and legislators to incorporate it into the policy and have them change. Also, another big issue is housing. So a lot of persons, once you identify as LGBT, you are turned away from your home or you are abandoned. So a lot of them end up on the street nowhere. So what we've done with that is we have actually created a housing center for persons. But the amount of persons compared to the shelter overwhelming. So that's something that we're trying to fix as well. But those are currently the issues that persons face there.
Thank you so much. It's great thank you for highlighting some of the intersectional issues that, of course, we need to be thinking, and we're discussing here today about sexual and reproductive health, but we need to consider the other factors that are happening. And now it sounds like a few of you are, your work is really being based in working with the communities that you're serving and finding out what the highest needs are and planning appropriately. And thank you for sharing. Ramesh, last but certainly not least, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so when it comes to like cultural spaces, one of the gaps that we see is that like the organizations and spaces that do exist that young people are accessing often only address like one aspect of that person's identity while sometimes neglecting or even being harmful around other aspects of people's identities. So for example, one of the things that we heard in like focus groups and surveys around young LGBTQ Muslims is that they would often, right, when they're accessing Muslim spaces, those spaces are often not as supportive of their like gender or sexuality, and then vice versa when they're accessing spaces that are LGBTQ focused and centers, those spaces often don't accommodate or have capacity around their like Muslim or other identities. And so they're chilled out of both spaces sometimes. And then we see the same thing taking place at the provider level, right? So even when we have wonderful healthcare providers, service providers, other folks who do have capacity around these issue areas, they'll see someone walk in who looks visibly Muslim for whatever reason or is in a hijab or something like this, and then sometimes not offer the same care that they otherwise would to any other LGBTQ person who walked in through those doors, or make assumptions about that person's gender or sexual identity based on, appearance. And so, we've moved on to trying to make sure that we're expanding folks, providers' capacity around those areas as well, making sure that people are seen in their fullness of identity and held in that, both by providers and by the organizations that are serving them.
Thank you. That's so important to highlight that sexual and gender identities are only one portion of people's full identities, and being able to respect and recognize all aspects of a person's identity is so critical. So the next question that we have for all of you is around social norms. Social norms and the roles of others in young people's lives, such as parents, teachers, and some of the folks you've already highlighted, often impact the sexual and reproductive health of young people. And would love to hear from all of you about how the social norms and the roles that other influential people play in the lives of young people are specifically impacting gender and sexual minority youth. Sean, could we have you start with this one?
Most definitely. So here in Jamaica, being predominantly a Christian country, we have a saying where children should be seen and not heard. So whatever issues a child may be going through, or an adolescent or a youth, it's something that you should keep to yourself, especially if it's surrounding your sexual identity and your sexual reproductive health. So a lot of parents will teach their children, keep it to yourself. You don't share what's happening to you out of fear that the child may be ostracized or the teen may be, disfellowship from friendship from persons. So they urge us not to share these information. Also, I'm not, as I said before, being a predominant Christian country, these information, they're not taught in any at all. The learning of sexuality and gender is left to the parents to pass this on to children. And in fact, parents themselves don't have the information. So children are left to wonder about what's happening to them, who they are, what's happening, and then that leads to dangerous choices as it relates to sexual reproductive health. Also, being young, persons will participate in sexual activity, point blank. And if there is an issue, whether it be an infection or they don't go to get treatment because they don't want their parents to know, based on the fact that you shouldn't, as a Christian country, you should not be having sex outside of marriage. You being young and having sex, it's taboo. So all of this is just bottled up inside, and they don't have an outlet. They don't know who to talk to, who to turn to, and it leads to problems.
Thank you. Jessie, would you like to add in next?
I think Sean has made a really good point on bringing up our religious values within the family relations. And that's most predominant as well for us here in the Philippines, because we also are a very predominantly Christian country. And as mentioned, parent and child relationships do remain as one of the strongest predictors of LGBTQ plus adolescent health, or LGBTQ plus health and adjustment. So there are unique family experiences, I might say, that is related to sexual and gender identities that may or may not, that may have positive effects, that could be like warmth and your support, like support on your transitioning, or if your child has certain sexual health needs, you support them. Or it could also have those family relations could also have negative effects, like especially for LGBTQ plus youth, like rejection or psychological control, and that is based on, or that affects their health and well-being. And we know that LGBTQ plus youth are at a heightened risk for multiple negative physical and mental health outcomes. But we also know that LGBTQ plus youth can thrive when provided the right support, especially from their parents or within their family. So yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to talk a little bit about the context in Pakistan?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, the LGBT movement is not so strong in Pakistan. Only the transgender movement is strong, and we have a historic bill in shape of Trans Protection Act 2018 in Pakistan, which is a very progressive bill in the history of the country. But still, there is a lot of things. There is a lot of efforts that needs to be put on in terms of treating the transgender people as equal citizens. There are changes on the macro level, for instance, on governance and policy level, but still there is no change on micro level. Like there is no family acceptance, there is no relative acceptance, there is no sensitization on school level, college level. So this is the issue, as well as the transgender community are not so economically empowered. That is a big thing, that they are dependent on their abusers financially, which is a very important cause of human rights violations that is happening on the transgender people in Pakistan. And we organizations are making effort to make transgender people economically empowered, so that they can make better their life choices.
Thank you for adding that extra context. Ramesh, would you like to add in?
Yeah, could you repeat the question for me, please?
Of course. So the question was broadly about social norms and the role of others in young people's lives. So thinking parents, teachers, anyone who has an influential role, and how do these norms and the roles of others impact sexual and reproductive health needs of sexual and gender minority youth?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so definitely parents, teachers, providers, all these folks that young people interact with help like dictate the social norms around gender and sexuality for young people. And so our area of focus around that has typically been, when it comes to that culture change and that social work, has been young folks themselves. So for example, like on social media, we try really hard every single year to ensure that there are visibility campaigns around certain groups of multiply marginalized LGBTQ young people. Right, so when it comes to young people of color, how are we making sure that like young trans people of color are apparent in like the media that we see every day and that we interact with? The easiest way to do that for us has been through social media. How do we make sure that LGBTQ young Muslims are like seen and read in their fullness of being? We have, yeah, launched those visibility campaigns on social media. And so while we do that work around expanding sensitivity and capacity for these adult allies and service providers in particular, when it comes to that culture change work, it's the young people directly that we target and support in creating their own narratives around themselves and their lives.
Great, thank you. We'll move ahead to the next question. So how are young people from sexual and gender minorities being incorporated into the design of sexual and reproductive health programs? What are all of our panelists seeing in the different countries and context in which they work? And Ramesh, will you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so we at Advocates really try hard to make sure that they're incorporated into those sexual and reproductive health programs, like from the ground up. So not just that we're building them with young people in mind, but that young people are there sort of designing the programs, dictating their own community needs, fighting for the legislation and the funding that's needed for those particular programs as well, getting educated in that direct service capacity as well as like peer educators, as abortion providers, as sexuality educators, all of that stuff. And so it's always been about, not just doing this on behalf of young people, but making sure that they are constantly in the room while decisions that impact their lives are being made.
Jesse, would you like to share next?
Yeah, Ramesh had a very good point, but I also would add to that many youth programs have been housed within, especially here in the Philippines, within the NGOs or non-governmental organizations working on SRHR. But these efforts or some higher efforts to establish mechanisms of participation would include like youth representatives in councils or committees. But we all know that having a youth program or having a youth project within our organization doesn't necessarily guarantee youth participation. And I'm not discrediting that advancement and that initiative, and that organizations like IYAFP also make a good platform for youth participation and engagement regards to SRHR. But sometimes we need systems, bigger systems than those NGOs need to be in place to ensure that youth are integrated within this project and within this meaningful organizations. And I guess I would have to echo what Ramesh said, that we are missing minoritized groups sometimes in our discussions, and those groups are the ones that the systems that we are operating on, they're the ones that making us minorities, and we're not even involving them. So I think people like us from the LGBTQ plus community especially, we need to be involved in those consultations, especially for services that are targeted to us. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Hi, yes, can you please repeat the question?
Of course. How are young people from sexual and gender minorities being incorporated into the design of sexual and reproductive health programs? You can share some from what you know about your work in Pakistan.
So it's like when we talk about like 5 years back, there was no concept of inclusion. There were no concept of diversified young people in SRHR programs. But now things are being changed, not fully, but somehow. Big organizations are making efforts to include LGBTIQ young people in family planning programs, as well as the international organizations are putting efforts to ensure that there is the progressive inclusion in the SRHR and family planning programs on national level.
Slow but steady progress, but always more to go. Sean?
Okay, so while the problem it's directed to the LGBT youth, the problem isn't the LGBT youth. So what we've done in Jamaica, we have trained over 1,000 healthcare workers after identifying that access to information and access to healthcare spaces is a problem. We've trained over 1,000 healthcare workers to better understand LGBT youth and the issues that they may face and how to help to alleviate and address these issues. Also, what we have done is after training them, we didn't just train them and allow them to go back to work. We did various mystery shopping where persons will access the spaces, pretending to be patients to see how they would be received, perceived. And to be honest, it has been really, really good. It's been a step in the right direction. Healthcare persons are more aware of LGBT youth issues and how to handle these issues. And also what we've done too is we've targeted the university level where we're trying to get curriculum changed to include LGBT healthcare. So once it's taught at that level, they should have this information where they don't need to be sensitized in the future. So that's where we're at now.
That's so great to hear in terms of training the next generation and making sure that this is on the curriculum for everyone moving forward. And so, oh yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to comment really quick before we move on. I also wanted to add that one of the ways in which I personally try to think about this is how are we working on building like capacity within young people's communities, rather than relying once again on the service providers that already do exist, whether those be NGOs, other healthcare providers, things like that. So the question that I'm asking myself is like, how are we building a world where our current work is no longer needed and where young people have the tools and resources and ability and support that they need in order to do this work themselves? So that's continuously guiding the design of these SRH programs.
Thank you for sharing. And yes, I think the hope is one day that we are all working ourselves out of our current jobs and won't have to do so much of this work anymore, that'll just be the norm. All right. And now if we're going to move on to some of the live questions from the chat and from the audience here today. So thank you for everyone who has sent in a question. One of the questions we received was about the role of public and private services and how the sexual and reproductive health services might be similar or differ for young people based on whether they're accessing public or private. Jessie, would you like to start us off?
I think there's a wide difference, especially for LGBT plus people accessing those services. Especially here in the context of the Philippines, not all trans people are capable or have all the privilege to go in a private care to receive. I think I see one question here to receive proper services or SRHR services, and it's more expensive. So people would have to settle for, let's say, community-based organizations or like community centers to receive the services. And I think that the initiative that CBOs and NGOs do to serve the community is good, and I think sometimes better than those of the private hospitals. And yeah, those are some of the things that I can say for the question.
Yeah, great, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in on this?
Yes, I'd like to say that here in Jamaica, if you're LGBT, your access to healthcare is predominantly based on your socioeconomic background. So if you are from a higher level, you're able to access better care, better medication. However, if you're from a lower strata, you will not get the best care. You're given something and expected to work with it. And sometimes you're not even given anything at all based on who you identify as. So that's one of the things that we're working on, trying to get everybody to be inclusive, trying to get everybody to be able to access the same level of care that you deserve as a human being. So that's where we are here in Jamaica, trying to just get everybody on the same level, regardless of who you are, what you can afford. That's what we are.
Exactly, thank you. Sarah or Mish, would either of you like to add in? All right. Perfect. Well, We can go ahead on to and the next question, and anyone who please feel free to keep adding questions into the chat. We've hinted at this in some of your answers already, but another question that some of our audience members were interested in is knowing what sexual health education is like in the different contexts in which all four of you work. And what are some of the challenges that have been identified in trying to make inclusive sexual health education in your countries, and how can we ensure security for LGBTQ youth as we're doing this work? Sean, would you like to start?
Okay, so the issue we have here is LGBT issues, questions. These are things we don't speak about, we should speak about. So persons tend to shy away from it or sweep it under the rug. So whatever issues they have, it will fester and become a bigger issue. So what we've done here in Jamaica is, because as an agency that is openly LGBT friendly, we are not allowed to access certain spaces. So what we've done is we've reached out to persons who are better able to access certain spaces, such as youth leaders, parliamentarians, and then we've trained these persons surrounding sexual and reproductive health, pronoun awareness, gender and identity, and then allow them to go back into their spaces and spread the information without actually going to the spaces ourselves, because we're not really welcomed. So that's what we do. We've done a lot of sensitization, sending back out into the communities, and they pass the information on. A lot of times they don't even know that they're doing it. They may hear a conversation, and based on what's happening, they will say stuff and not really understanding that they're actually helping the conversation to go forward in a positive way. So I think that is a good thing. Sensitization, training sessions for youths who can better reach other youths. And also what we've done as well, we've targeted social media platforms. So we would, on a daily basis, just give random information around sexual reproductive health, and persons will, oh, I didn't know this, whatever, share it with somebody else, and that's how the information gets passed on.
Yes, so youth training the youth is the best way, one of the best ways we can move this forward. Would any of the other panelists like to share on this question?
Sure. For us, what we look at is that there's often this like patchwork of like different, legislation or policies around sexuality education for different areas. So in certain states, there is like a unified sexuality education framework. In other states, there isn't. Even in states where there is, there's often like a patchwork at the local, like school district or city level. And so this fight is taking place at all levels, at the super hyper local level of the school district or city, but also at the state, also at the federal level, also advocating for this kind of stuff internationally. And so one of the ways in which we combat this patchwork is one thing that we had been hearing from young people again and again for a number of years, particularly young folks who had been provided with like either harmful LGBTQ exclusive sexuality education or abstinence only sex education, is that they were accessing information about their sexuality, their relationships, their health through the internet. And so we thought, why don't we, meet folks where they're at and how they're accessing this information. Since then, we've launched like an Amaze initiative, which is a series of like short animated videos and clips aimed at like a middle school age kind of audience. Really short, try to be funny, all of that stuff, to give folks information about the questions that they were most commonly asking and seeking information on. Where they're at on the internet, so folks are able to access it on their phones with their headphones in, so they're not embarrassed about watching those videos or having that information displayed or anything like that. And then since then we've also translated those videos into a number of like languages and cultural contexts for around the world, so folks around the world are able to access it as well.
That sounds like a wonderful program. Thank you. And Jessie, would you like to add in as well?
Yeah, I think sexual education or sex education here in the Philippines is kind of hard to implement because, and I think some of our viewers here from the Philippines would agree that there have been a lot of issues having or including sex education into the education curriculum. And these are mostly argued within the Catholic or, the religious groups, because they have been, against it, and apparently it goes against their beliefs and values. So Catholic schools wouldn't agree on having sex education because apparently it's like harmful and not helpful to them. And yeah, I guess I would like to echo what Ramesh said, that most of the young people now, they get their sexual health information on the internet. I could be scrolling on TikTok and looking at how to put on a condom and call it a day. And that's the reality that we are now. So that's why youth organizations like IYFP, we have been using that platform, because we could say that it is effective. I could be scrolling at 12 a.m. looking at how to properly do anal sex, which is totally all right, And that's my take on the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. Sarah, are you still with us? Would you like to add in on this question as well? Looks like, are you there? You may think Sarah may have dropped off. Okay. All right, we'll just go ahead and move on to the next question then, that we would love for all of the panelists to weigh in on. And several folks in the chat mentioned the role of, asked questions around the role of religion and religious identities. What are some of the best practices or recommendations for engaging religious leaders on the sexual and reproductive health of young people from sexual and gender minorities? Jessie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, with regards to speaking or with regards to having conversations with, religious groups, I think in the Philippines, luckily, there are people who are open-minded and who are willing to consult with the community, with us. And we've personally done this. We've talked to religious like fathers, our bishops, on churches and religious groups like that. And I think just the thought of having them have that initiative to reach out to us and understand our lived experience would really help, unite maybe the differences we have had in terms of, your religious identity and my personal sex and gender identity. So that's it.
Okay. Sean, would you like to share next?
Right. So just echoing what just said, even in Jamaica, we have our grosses as it relates to LGBT persons. We do have the support of many persons from the religious community. A lot of them are open-minded, and they tend to do understand, because funny enough, a lot of them have children who identify as LGBT. So they do understand and they do engage with us, and they do provide us with best practices, how to navigate certain spaces, how to bring forward certain questions. So we don't really have an issue as it relates to the religious community, but yeah, they're pretty open-minded and understanding.
That's great to hear from both you and Jessie, that attitudes are changing and you're coming across open-minded folks as you're doing your work. And Manish, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So our work around particularly religiously identified young people has been working with the young people themselves rather than targeting the religious leaders who are often still, conservative and not as sort of amenable to the stuff that we're bringing to the table. And so it's been a lot of culture shifting work at the very beginning, ensuring that religiously identified young people who are also queer or trans or any other number of identities feel like they are able to have both of those identities coexist in themselves and in their worlds. And so we've worked a lot on making sure that these identities are visible, that when you're Googling things around these identities, you get certain resources that reassure you that, it's okay to hold these multiple identities that you hold, that you're able to navigate them with, however you choose, with your own autonomy, with your own decision-making around them, all of that good stuff. Yeah, and so the work has often been just building the capacity of religiously identified young people internally to create their own community and create their own spaces around that religious identity, however they see fit and however they choose, rather than trying to engage like the orthodoxy around that particular religious community. And we have seen it sort of trickle up from the bottom, if that makes sense. So rather than seeing folks, right, rather than identifying leaders and then targeting them and then with them, which is something that we had tried to do, we're seeing that instead those same leaders are responding a little more robustly when it's the young people in their communities who are starting to change and demand a different world for themselves.
That's great to hear that you're seeing already some of the impact of that work and it moving on up. And it looks like Sarah may have rejoined us. Can you hear us, Sarah? We would love for you to weigh in on this last question, which was about the role of religion and religious identities, and what are some best practices or recommendations for engaging religious leaders as you've been doing this work in Pakistan.
So in Pakistan, people are confused between intersex and transgender. And there is some cushion in religious perspective in Islam for the transgender and intersex people. So that's why we have a bill passed in the parliament and people have a soft corner for the transgender people that is not for the other sexual and gender minorities. So that's why transgender people are leading the movement, I guess, not only in Pakistan, but in South Asia as a whole.
Great, thank you. We are just about at time here. So want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. This has really been a great conversation and not only wonderful to hear all of the great work that the four of you are doing, but the work that you all are also doing to build capacity among the youth that you're serving, as well as the teachers and providers and members of the community who are interacting with that. And we, again, really appreciate your time and hope you all enjoy the conversation. I'm going to hand it back over to Brittany to wrap up.
Great. Thanks so much to all of our great speakers and our great moderator today. We really appreciate this conversation. This has been a really engaging and thoughtful conversation. And we thank you all as well for your great questions. I want to remind you that we'll be posting and sending out a recording of today's webinar. And we encourage you to follow FP2030 and Knowledge SUCCESS at the handles that you see on the slide to stay up to date on resources, activities, and upcoming events. Again, thank you to all of our speakers, our great moderator, and we will see you next time. Our next theme will be launching in October, so be on the lookout for more communications shortly. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful day, evening, and night. Bye.